Imagine for a moment that you're listening to your favorite album and you discover the band has released a game that goes with it, or now, so many years later, there's a virtual art exhibition that goes with it, and it lets you experience the music in a new, maybe weird way. Transmedia concept albums like Lattice Panorama, Beyoncé's Lemonade, Pink Floyd's The Wall, or even Radiohead's Kid A/Amnesiac create space for an exploration of time, using each layering of media to build temporal multiplicity, which results in a rich and vibrant story world experience for its audiences. I approach my music and writing practices with time in mind. How can I play with the perception of time? What does the temporal dimension mean across mediums? And how is it being manipulated by certain choices in my tense, rhythm, tempo, or word choice? Today, I'll explore what temporal multiplicity looks like in Lattice Panorama and how I approach it in my own PhD project, The Winding Everything of Nowhere. But first, a little bit about me. So my PhD investigates narrative techniques in transmedia concept albums. It's a practice-led creative and critical project that aims to interrogate the question, how are narrative elements transferred between media in transmedia concept albums to create a unified and/or dissonant story world? My project includes the creation of a transmedia concept album consisting of a novella, the lyrics for the album, and the screenplays for the music videos. In my critical investigation, I closely analyzed Pink Floyd's The Wall and La Dispute's Panorama, as well as my own work. Winding follows protagonist Penny as she embarks on a week-long journey through Australia while she grapples with her relationship and sense of self. At the heart of the story is the idea of connections and community. Each chapter corresponds with a day of the week. Within these days, memory and flashbacks are woven throughout Penny's present experiences to fabricate an overall narrative which moves forward while also fluidly shifting through time, what has been, what is, and what could have been. The album's lyrics and track listing have a different relationship with time. While they still follow Penny's journey, they use disnarration and a reflective tone to offer questions of what might have happened if different choices had been made. They're the same story playing out in different time. Meanwhile, the music videos that go with them try to weave in elements from both the novella and the album. Instrumental tracks are paired with long stretches of drive for Penny and maybe include dialogue or sign language to add to the story. But back to temporal multiplicity, because that's what we're looking at today. And what is it? Well, it's a phrase that builds on narratologist Gerard Genette's temporal duality, but that I aim to conceptualize within a transmedia storytelling context. Genette's duality suggests that there are two types of time at play in a story, the narrative time and the story time. And it's more complex than that, and I promise that I'll break it down further, but we'll start there. So narrative time plus story time equals temporal duality. I think that you can sort of see where I'm going with the term temporal multiplicity. And temporal multiplicity, as I'm defining it in my research, is particularly important to consider when constructing transmedia narratives, where temporal duality considers the interplay of time it takes to tell a narrative contrasted with the chronological timeframe of the narrative itself. Temporal multiplicity adds layers by also considering the time it takes to engage with all aspects of a transmedia concept album and how that might influence the audience's perception of narrative time. So temporal multiplicity in terms of storytelling and specifically transmedia storytelling is something that I'm still developing. But today we're going to have a little crash course on time and narrative, and I'll draw connections between narratological techniques and how they apply to music practice. Time is something that's discussed across many disciplines, and naturally, it comes up frequently in both my writing and music practices. It's one of those concepts that starts to slip away from you the more you try to pin it down. And mostly that's because it's something that is socially constructed, and because, like theorist Michael Scheffel says, it's not observable. right? We can only discuss time as something that we're experiencing. And in music, like it's a little bit different. We have ways of making time feel slightly more objective with tempo and time signatures and rhythm. But even then, when we play with the feeling of time passing, we use those same tools, right? So a 3-minute piece set at Vivace is really different to a 3-minute piece at Largo, and it's going to feel different for the audience. Time and narrative is similar, right? It can be used as a tool for revealing plot and even playing with the audience's perception or knowledge. So when I think about creating temporal multiplicity in my practice, I'm thinking about all of the elements of time that I consider when I'm creating a narrative. I think it's important to note here as well that at this point in my research, temporal multiplicity appears to lend itself much more to the practical side and the practice than the analytical one. So you can analyze a transmedia concept album and identify elements of temporal multiplicity or what makes a narrative temporally multiple. However, it can all sort of be merged or simplified into the larger umbrella of temporal duality as defined by Genette. So Genette says that from an analytical point of view, one has to distinguish between 3 levels of reference, which are characterized by their own temporality: story, discourse, and narrating. So even within his own notion of temporal duality, Genette identifies 3 levels of reference. The duality then comes from the difference between what David Herman calls the narrative and non-narrative types of text, or discourse versus narrative story, or medium versus plot. For transmedia concept albums, though, do we consider the music narrative or non-narrative? I'd argue that the album as a text is narrative, but within that, do the instrumentals like themselves build a narrative, or are they simply auxiliary components that enrich the narrative established in the lyrics? What Seymour Chapman would call the satellites of a story, extra detail. Again, I personally would argue that the music itself tells a narrative. I think it does both. And I think that narrative within music is almost like time in this sense. It's not always so easily pinned down, but it is known and it can be mapped. For David Herman, there is a greater emphasis placed on what interpretations the audience draws from narrative cues. And when you add a layer of music to those narrative cues, what then? And it's from this and Genette's duality that I start to shape temporal multiplicity. When approaching narrative, I'm looking for the interplay between techniques and mediums to understand how I'm manipulating time and what my audience might infer from this. If I add a certain effect, the guitar, how is that going to change the interpretation of the lyrics over the top of it? The concept of narrative versus non-narrative text, for me then, is lost when a text becomes a transmedia work, because the question of what is narrative versus non-narrative changes with medium specificity. But on to some examples. Panorama is La Dispute's fourth studio album. It uses a combination of interactive mediums to invite the audience into the story world created across the album. There are tabletop role-playing games, interactive video games, and a book which breaks down the process of writing. Each of these mediums adds a layer of narrative that encourages the audience to either consider their own responses or story, empathize with the characters further, or contextualize specific choices made by the band in creating a narrative. The plot is built around 2 characters, much like in Winding, but the emphasis is on the events that take place over time, which has to be established either in the lyrics or through musical signifiers. Usually, though, it's a combination of both. Today, I really only have time to discuss how a sense of time is constructed in the lyrics, but I make a few references to the games that are a part of this album, so I encourage you to check them out. Throughout Panorama, time remains fluid and malleable. The music in each track gives a sense of movement and works to reflect the environment. The lyrics weave a narrative sometimes in response to the music, but mostly in response to what seems to be the passing of time for the characters. The narrator appears to be moving on one timeline, a year, while reflecting on a larger timeline of multiple years, much like Penny is moving on a timeline of a week, but it spans decades. Meanwhile, the audience are able to move even further into the future or past of the narrative in the games. So both Winding and Panorama rely on narrative threads to create a sense of atmosphere and world. The number of narrative threads across different mediums in Panorama can obscure the core narrative. However, the story always returns to the narrator in the present, connecting the threads of time. I do the same thing in Winding. At times, though, this makes the album's narrative fuzzy and difficult to fully piece together. Where the recollection of stories is inherently flawed and fragmented, though, there is an opportunity for the audience to step in as author and discern their own meanings. Through the repetition of anxious thoughts and the details in the lyrics, we can infer that the narrator in Panorama is grappling with some form of trauma, the same way Penny is, sort of, in Winding. What we do know as well, though, is that trauma's effect on memory can often lead to a distortion of events that makes it easier emotionally for a person to remember, or, nostalgia. This becomes important in approaches that players take in the tabletop role-playing games, for example, but also why some details in the album might seem contradictory, unclear, or be interpreted completely differently from listener to listener. In novellas and lyrics, it's necessary to fabricate a sense of time through the use of memories and scenes of maybe what could have been. This blurs the line between real and unreal and opens up the story world to additional timelines and narrative possibilities that are outside of the constraints of chronological and or linear plot. With a blurring between those lines of the real and unreal, time becomes even more questionable, since we're unable to fully tell how long a character is spending in the realm of the unreal, and whether or not that directly correlates to their time in the real world. In Panorama, this is reflected in the lyrics, but also can be manipulated greatly by players when they engage with the games. Theorist Linda Hutchin argues that adaptation, for example, is storytelling through repetition. And while this album is not specifically adaptation, though there's a case for the adaptation between mediums, the cyclical organization of narrative threads does demonstrate how time is adapted through repetition to create narrative. So when I approach time and temporal multiplicity in Winding, I'm coming at it from a story perspective more often than not, even applying some adaptation techniques. I know that I have constraints on words and real time. A novella and an album are limited by their lengths, so my focus is then on how I can create a narrative that seems to encapsulate a great deal of time in a small amount of space. Much like La Dispute, I rely on memories, repetition, and a technique called disnarration. So in Fulton Street 1, in Panorama, Dreyer repeats the line, "Will I ever put flowers by the street?" twice in the fourth verse. The last line of the same verse is a variation of this line. Could I go and leave flowers by the street? It questions the narrator's ability to deal with grief and reveals to the audience the underlying anxiety that the narrator has about loss. A similar tactic is used later in verse 6, where Dreyer alters the line. Will I ever be half what I can be? To can I ever be half what I can be? To could I even be half of what you need? Will I ever be me? There's a repetition here in theme and a similarity in line construction and rhythm. The line starts as a question of time and shifts to a question of ability, and then to a question of time and ability. The repetition and variation of both lyrics and musical elements in Panorama works as characters or environments in an album's narrative, supporting Hutchin's statement that music offers oral equivalents for characters' emotions and in turn provokes affective responses in the audience. In Panorama and Winding, the narrative being told as a reflection that is constantly pulled into the past, present, and future works to create a temporal multiplicity resulting in time parallels between the past narrative and present narrative. There are endless ways of approaching the construction of a story, but an approach that focuses on the temporality and the multiplicities at play in a narrative naturally lends itself to the creation of a transmedia concept album. Thank you.